get you there. All right, well, I'm ready when you are, Chuckles.
You introduced the podcast.
I thought you said you had an intro. What's the matter with you?
No, you do the hellos and all that game, and then you mentioned that today we're going to be talking about Led Zeppelin, and then I'll do the intro.
Hang on, sorry, bear with me a second.
People who aren't ready.
So I'm just quickly responding to a text. I won't be 30 seconds. I said that.
We've heard this before.
Yeah, 30 seconds, 9 minutes later. All right, I'm ready when you... I've still got to do the introduction.
You do the intro.
You're a slapper and you know it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of Underrated Over...
That's not what it's called.
Every fucking time. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Overrated, Underrated. As always, I am your host Alex and I am joined by tall man James. How are you, James?
I'm okay. Happy New Year, everybody. We are now in 2021, which let's hope is not a fresh chapter of the hell that has been the last 12 months. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I am, well, yes, glad to be done with last year in one capacity or another, and really happy to be talking about a very fine band today. James, I believe you have got a bit of information for us. Talk to us about Led Zeppelin.
Led Zeppelin were formed in 1968 by guitarist and producer Jimmy Page. He formed the band from the ashes of the Yardbirds, of whom he was currently a member, and who during their career to that point had previously featured both Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck on guitar. In January 1968, their self-titled debut Led Zeppelin was released, and from then on the band's trajectory seemed to go endlessly and limitlessly upwards. Following the release of their untitled fourth album in 1971, the band had become arguably the biggest rock and roll band in the world. Somewhat unfairly labelled as a heavy rock band for much of their career and much maligned by the music press, Led Zeppelin offered a breadth of musical offering. Rooted in the blues, energised by rock and roll and infused with acoustic folk, it was this variety of composition that set the band apart from their peers. The band continued recording and touring for the entirety of the 1970s, releasing a total of 9 studio albums, with tales of excess on numerous world tours becoming the stuff of rock and roll legend. After reaching their peak in the early mid-1970s, various tragedies and dark occurrences haunted the band from 1977 until the end of their career. An almost fatal car crash, the untimely death of Robert Plant's young son, drug addictions, and the tragic death of drummer John Bonham in September 1980, which spelled the end of the band. With so much already said about this most mythical of groups, we thought we would take you on a journey through our overrated and underrated selections of their albums and songs. It's sure to be filled with much disagreement and controversy as always, so without further ado, Alex, talk me through your overrated.
I'm going to start with Overrated album, and so James and I spoke a little bit before this podcast, and we both agreed that of all the bands we've done so far, this was probably the most difficult. Now, I'm not sure about you, James, but my reasoning and rationale for why I think it's the most difficult is because I think for the most part, they're a band that were not necessarily at the time well received, but in hindsight and retrospectively have most of their what you would call their famous music, i.e. this kind of the sort of first sort of decade or so of their discography is quite well received. So it's a little bit, and it's good as well. There's quite a consistent quality about it. So it is a bit difficult to talk about things being overrated and underrated with Led Zeppelin, or harder.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing I've ever learnt by being a big fan of the 60s and 70s music scene and the 80s to some degree, and the 90s, I'm a fan of music in general, but the 70s in particular, if there's one thing I've realised, it's that basically music critics of the time largely had no idea what they were talking about.
Absolutely.
Because so many bands that both you and I hold in high esteem now and are generally considered to be among the greatest were basically treated with complete indifference in the 1970s, and I think Led Zeppelin are pretty much a case in point of that. In fact, I'll make a bit of reference to that later on when we talk about their fourth album. But it's weird that they're almost more... They've become more legendary since they split up, or since they were forced to basically stop for, sad reasons. And I think that probably has a little bit to do with the mythology that surrounds the band now, because obviously they ended at an unexpected time. They didn't split up of their own accord. And yeah, but I know I do agree that this has been the most difficult one for me. The Beatles one was quite tricky as well. I didn't struggle with the Floyd one at all, really, because there was sort of 4 or 5 big hitter albums in there that were always going to be the ones that, they get the conversation. But yeah, I did agree. So what did you eventually settle on for yours?
The one I settled on, so I basically scoured the internet for kind of consensus opinion of what people generally think is their best album, because there's an obvious drop-off. I'm sure you'll agree, there's an obvious drop-off in quality towards the back end of their catalogue, but
yes,
I kind of looked at their first 6 albums, shall we say, and thought, which of these that is generally considered to, or is occasionally or frequently called their best album, do I disagree with ever being called their best album? And the conclusion I came to was Houses of the Holy.
We're going to have a disagreement today then.
And it's not because I dislike it, but it's because I saw it fairly frequently called their best or their second best album, and I don't agree with that. I put it very mid-catalogue. The other temptation is to say Led Zeppelin 4, because it's frequently called their best album, but I think it has more of a right to be called that.
Yeah,
those two are generally the two that I would say are frequently called their best album, that I don't think have a legitimate claim to be called that. And so I kind of narrowed it down to the two, and I sort of thought, well, which of these two do I think is better? I think Led Zeppelin 4 is better than Houses of the Holy, marginally so, but I think it is, and therefore kind of this is more of a, I don't actually think Houses of the Holy is a particularly overrated album, but if I had to pick one of their albums that is overrated, it is that one, because it's probably not quite as good as some people think it is, even though actually it's probably maybe 3rd or 4th in my list of their albums, but the quality gap between that and what I think is their best album is pretty much a hairline fracture. So it's a bit of a default setting, and that's going to be a very common theme amongst this. I do think as a band, the consistency throughout their music, particularly in their peak between the kind of late 60s and mid 70s, was quite impressive.
Oh, it really was, and I think we're probably in agreement here. We won't talk about what it isn't yet, but there's only really one album in their discography that I genuinely don't like, and we will come on to that later on.
Okay.
I also struggled quite a lot with deciding my overrated ones, far more than any of the other ones, to be honest. But I did sort of settle on possibly a controversial choice, but I actually think that Led Zeppelin 2 is their most overrated album. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people who'll be listening to this who will think, how could you possibly say such a thing? And yeah, I agree, there are some songs on there, things like Heartbreaker and Ramble On and Thank You and stuff like that is great. I do think it's great, and I've only chosen this one. Well, there's 2 reasons I've chosen this one. Firstly, I don't think it's as good as their first album. Ignoring the fact that their first album, there is a lot of cover material on it, albeit, yeah, granted, that's the case with Led Zeppelin throughout their career, but I don't think Led Zeppelin 2 is quite as good as it's claimed to be, and there are a few weak moments on that album. I think there is Living Loving Maid, which I'm not that keen on as a song at all. With a purple umbrella and a 50-cent hand. There is a 4-minute drum solo on it, which, while I'm a huge John Bonham fan, not sure we need a drum solo on a record in a studio, to be honest with you.
It's a bit superfluous, isn't it?
Yeah, I feel like it's a bit of a waste of time. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm as I said, huge John Bonham fan. I can appreciate a great drummer when I see one. Not sure there needs to be a studio album cut of a drum solo, though. I think they should be reserved for live forums. And in fact, Moby Dick, which is the drum solo I'm talking about, was infamously extended to upwards of 15 minutes when they're in their live set, which again I would argue is maybe a bit overkill. But yeah, there's just something about Led Zeppelin 2. This is not me saying I don't like it. This is me basically having a gun to my head and saying what do I think's overrated. And like you, I had to pick from their first sort of 5-6 albums to do that, because I think the consensus is that the quality drops off later on anyway. So I have to go for one of the big hitter ones, and I just couldn't bring myself to pick any of the other ones because I think all the other ones are so great, as we will come on to later.
Of those that are considered at least passable, you mean?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
In tradition of the podcast, then we have to move on to overrated song. So this is a little bit more difficult again. So I'll let you go first.
I don't know. Okay, so I'll... My overrated song is actually a song that I don't mind at all. But it is... Likewise. It is and it's not, and based on everything that everybody would know about me having listened to this podcast, it is absolutely not the song you think I'm going to say. And the reason it's not the song you think I'm going to say is because whilst I'm not sure if it deserves the acclaim that it deserves, and everyone knows what I'm talking about here.
Yes.
There is an undeniable quality to so much of that song that I don't think it can be called overrated as much as some of their other songs. And there are a couple of songs that people tend to know by them in a strange way that I kind of think it's the classic. It's not even the best song off that album. So without kind of like dwelling too much further in my opinion, their most overrated song is the Immigrant Song.
Okay, interesting. Ignoring the fact that I obviously thought you, of all people, were going to go for the big one.
Stairway to Heaven, which I'm not going to.
Obviously, I thought that was what you were going to go for. Yeah, okay. I can see why there's an argument for that. Again, I feel like we're going to caveat this a lot in this podcast. It doesn't mean we don't like it, and I'm sure you like that song as well.
It's a great song. There's no doubt about that. But in actuality, I did entertain possibly the idea of putting Led Zeppelin 3 as my overrated album as well. And the reason I didn't is because I thought it's just not generally... It hasn't got the same esteem that other albums have anyway. So
it's not got the same aesthetic as a lot of other albums.
No, exactly.
Just mentioning the thing about the critic thing for a second that I mentioned earlier. Led Zeppelin recorded the first two albums, obviously more straight ahead sort of rock and roll blues type albums. They were met with large indifference from the 70s, 60s, 70s music press, as clearly most good things in that era seem to be. And so they decided to show another side of themselves with the third album, which is, if you listen to it, predominantly acoustic. There's a lot of stuff on the third album which is not... In fact, Immigrant Song is almost like the notable exception as being the one, and maybe Since I've Been Loving You, which is basically a blues thing, but it's basically the only electric song on the whole album. You've got things like Gallows Pole and Tangerine, which is a really neat little song. That's the Way, which is one of my favourites on that album. Bron-Ra Stomp. There's a lot of acoustic stuff on that album that sets it apart from the rest, almost. I don't know how I'm gonna tell you. I can't play with you no more. And I believe at the time that was also met with sort of indifference as well. It was like, they just want to be Crosby, Stills and Nash now. They're just... Yeah, you can't defend some music critics. That
was a frequent accusation, actually, after Led Zeppelin 3, was that they were trying to be Crosby, Stills, Nash, which is the most ludicrous claim you've ever heard, especially if you heard Led Zeppelin 2 and Led Zeppelin 4.
Yeah, and I think Led Zeppelin 4, just on that note, was almost like the perfect marriage between what they were doing in 1 and 2 and what they did in 3. They combined the acoustic. There's a lot of stuff on Led Zeppelin 4 that's acoustic again. Their most famous song of all time is... at least 40 or 50% acoustic, And there's also things like Going to California and stuff like that on there, which is acoustic based or folk based. And that's the thing that differentiates Zeppelin from bands of the era like Black Sabbath, where they never really went into that territory. It was more straight ahead kind of electric stuff all the time. And
yeah,
I actually thought you were going to put the Led Zeppelin 3 as your overrated one, because I wasn't sure how the acoustic stuff would fit.
It was second place. I will not lie, it was second place. Because I don't... as much as there's a temptation to say Led Zeppelin 4, I can justify Led Zeppelin 4 being their best album. I don't think it's their best album, spoiler alert. But I can justify that more than I can justify Houses of the Holy, which is sometimes called their best album. Whereas I don't ever hear Led Zeppelin 3 called their best album. But I hear Houses of the Holy called their best album a lot, and I'm sorry, that's nonsense. Like, it's good, it's not great, it's one of those. The other song I did entertain as just chucking in as a most overrated, and again, I don't mind this song, but there's a bit of a like for Ramble On, which I don't get as well.
Oh, I like Ramble On a lot.
I like it, but I don't like it as much as I like a lot of other songs by them. And
did you see that video, by the way, that Rick Beato did on YouTube, which is a great channel, by the way, for the listeners, if you've never paid any attention to him. But
anybody who's interested, particularly in music theory and kind of the more deep dive stuff of music in terms of just music theory, Rick Beato is actually... He's a bit of a love it or hate it person. Like, a lot of people don't like him, but there's no denying his music theory and his kind of the way he like breaks down and underpins music is very, very good.
He did a great video about it. He basically went out his way to try and achieve the acoustic guitar sound on Ramble On.
Yeah.
And he got the same type of guitar and he did the same type of microphone and everything. He was trying to achieve this, like, it's quite a well-known acoustic guitar tone, which is not easy to copy. And he does a quite good job of it, actually. But yeah, if anyone out there has not watched any Rick Beato stuff, and you've got an interest in this kind of music, and he does all types of music, doesn't he? Really, rock prog. He does have a leaning towards that kind of era, I suppose.
It's generally rock music, but to be fair, Beato, I mean, he's a music producer, isn't he? I believe, or something like that. But yeah, he's just a very, very knowledgeable music producer who breaks down songs, albums, bands, whatever. He's quite well known for breaking down individual famous songs. And one thing I will say is that if he ever does a song that you particularly like, something that's very, very interesting is hearing the different parts isolated.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
And understanding how songs were recorded. Yeah, well worth it. Anyone who's not heard Rick Beato, really, really recommend it. Well worth looking at. We're going to shift a little bit quickly. What is your overrated song, James?
Well, I'm going after a big hitter here, and I know that's a phrase that gives you a little tingle of excitement all the time because you are the king of going after big hitters.
I am erect.
Yeah. Well, I thought you would be because, again, this was difficult, and this is not me saying I don't like the song at all because it's one of their most famous songs of all of them. Quite famously used as the theme music for a certain music-based TV program.
He's only done it.
You know what it's going to be, don't you?
You're a piece of shit and you know it.
I don't have as much of a loving for Whole Lotta Love as maybe other people do, although it is, as you said earlier, it is a hairline fracture away from... It's a difficult decision to make, but of all of their most famous songs, and that's got to be one of the top 3, probably 4 maybe, that's the one that... a little bit more take it or leave it. I think it's fantastic, I love it, it's great, and I know we've had a conversation about this in the past before, but I don't actually mind the middle section of psychedelic noises.
So I'm very, for anyone who's probably not heard, we've never spoken about it on the podcast, I'm a big fan of the song with the exception of probably like at least a minute and a half section in the middle, which is basically Robert Plant having an orgasm before a really, really good guitar solo kicks in. The
guitar solo is great.
Guitar solo is great. Robert Plant having an orgasm is questionable.
It depends if you're a 70s groupie, really, isn't it? But nonetheless, I like it a lot. I think it's a great song, and obviously it became super famous by being, well, it was a cover version, I believe, eventually, that was the theme song to Top of the Pops, and it's a very famous riff. It is ripped off, by the way. I don't know if you know, But
Stop ruining Led Zeppelin for me. People have already done that with Spirit and other things.
Yeah, and Days of Confused wasn't written by them. And
I mean, the whole first album was basically covers, which is a bit disappointing. But
yeah, Whole Lot of Love is basically I don't want to say it's a cover, but it's an interpretation of a song that Muddy Waters recorded in the 60s called You Need Love, which the riff is quite similar, and it is an interpretation. That said, the blues is one of those genres where everybody from Eric Clapton to Jeff Beck to Jimmy Page to Joe Bonamassa, Rory Gallagher, they've all done versions of famous blues songs, because the blues is, I'm not going to say it's limited in terms of what it is fundamentally, but there's only so many different variations of the 1-4-5 chord progression you can do with a turnaround and a pentatonic solo over the top of it. Blues is just naturally something that is interpreted by various people. You know, Crossroads by Cream ain't by Cream, it's by Robert Johnson. It's all just interpretations, different versions. Yeah, anyway, without going off onto a tangent too much, yeah, Whole Lot of Love is probably my choice, although I'll probably, when I'm editing this podcast in a couple of days, decide that it's a different one, because it is difficult to choose for me.
Bit difficult to argue with that. I am going to push back ever so slightly on that, just because I know there is a bit of an irony of the fact that it was used as the Top of the Pops theme tune for an awful long time, which is literally ridiculous, all things considered, considering, as we've spoken about, the nature of the band and the general consensus of the band. I think that is a song that is propped up enough by guitar tone particularly. The riff is impressive, the guitar solo is impressive, and weirdly, actually, something I have noticed in the past, I don't often see. So if you get, I'm sure James and I have both done plenty of seeing classic rock cover bands in like local pubs and stuff like that. I think Led Zeppelin are a suspiciously underrepresented band in classic pub band cover bands, and the reason is, I think, because it's very, very difficult to replicate the vocals. You can do the drums, you can do the bass, you can do a passable job on the guitar, but it is very, very difficult to get anyone to do a Robert Plant.
Yeah, especially in a song like that, where
exactly.
I'll talk a little bit about his vocal work a bit later on, because I've got a few comments to make about that. But certainly in the early days, as we would be in Led Zeppelin 2, he's probably 23 years old at the time, maybe not even that.
Please stop telling me that Robert Plant was 5 years younger than me when he made that song. Good Lord.
We've had this discussion before, haven't we? I mean, we've passed it.
We're still waiting for I'm still waiting for you to, just one day
write subdivisions.
Write subdivisions out of the blue, because that's the age we're at. But that is, I think, is one of the things that's underappreciated a little bit about Led Zeppelin on the whole, is that Robert Plant's vocals add a dynamic that's very, very, very difficult to emulate, and I think that puts people off covering them, probably for a good thing.
Also, as an enthusiastic guitarist, I somewhat unwillingly, I suppose, kind of, in some respects, sort of, some of the time, put Jimmy Page in the overrated category.
I agree.
I do think he was a better producer than he was a guitarist, particularly live, and I think Whole Lot of Love is a good example of his great production, actually, because if you listen to the riff at the start of that, there's a really cool effect that goes on in the sort of in your headphones, where there's like a reverb, and that's a natural reverb done by literally putting a microphone at the other end of a big hall where they were recording it, and it creates this natural echo reverb type thing, and it's little production techniques like that he sort of almost pioneered, because back in those days it wasn't as, even the Beatles weren't experimenting in that kind of way, and he did sort of forge a new path in that sense. He was a great producer, and I think he was a great guitarist in a lot of senses, not the ones that he's probably most famous for, though. I think he was better. He's a great acoustic guitar player.
I was going to say, we will get to that later. I will just add, just because you're talking about Whole Lot of Love, and we have mentioned that there is a small amount of concept of Led Zeppelin 2 being overrated. I do think Led Zeppelin 2 has the benefits from albums of, if you were a fan of Led Zeppelin when they released their first album and the first thing you heard from their next album was Whole Lot of Love, you'd be pretty excited. It is hearing Subdivisions after Rush have just released Moving Pictures, which for those who haven't heard any of our Rush stuff, like, I am a massive fan of the song. In fact, I would probably go as far as to say it's objectively my favourite song by Rush, and it was released after their unobjectively best album.
Yeah.
And it was the first song, so you just heard the best album by about one of the greatest bands of all time, and the first song they released after that is the best song they've ever written. And if you aren't, I mean, if there's ever a reason to masturbate to music, it is that. And with that, I feel like we should probably move on.
I feel like we should. It's onto the underrated one, which is always my favourite category, I think, in all of this stuff.
I want you to take the lead on this, actually. Underrated song. We underrated album first, yeah?
We got to do album first, yeah?
I still want you to take the lead on both of these, actually.
I will duly oblige. We've mentioned this album before already. I actually think their most underrated album is Houses of the Holy.
You're an absolute idiot. Explain yourself.
Because Houses of the Holy is placed in their release list in an awkward position between Led Zeppelin 4 and Physical Graffiti. And as we'll come on to later on, that's quite an awkward place to be in my opinion. But you hear people talk about Led Zeppelin 4 all the time, and yet, as we've discussed, it's in my opinion, it's worthy of the praise it gets. I 100% agree with that, and again, I'm sure we'll mention that album again at some point. Houses of the Holy, I think, sometimes gets overlooked a little bit because it's not one of their... It's the first time they had an album that wasn't named after themselves or didn't have a title at all. In the case of Led Zeppelin 4,
which we're agreeing, but we're agreeing to call it Led Zeppelin 4 because we're not idiots.
Yeah, it's either Led Zeppelin 4 or Four Symbols or the fourth album.
I'm not calling it Zoso. I'm sorry, I'm not calling it that.
also, but no, it's Led Zeppelin 4 basically. And I think actually on that note, the reason that they didn't put a title on the cover at all or any information about it was because I think it was a reaction to the music press, because they were getting so fed up of getting negative reviews and people not paying enough attention, and they're basically right, we're just going to release this without a title on it and people can just listen to it without knowing who it is. They would probably figure out who it was, but you know what I mean? It was like a bit of a fuck you to the music press, like, right, we're just going to release this without any title or anything on it. But anyway, House of the Holy came out afterwards. House of the Holy came out in 1973, and I think it's underrated because it's got one of my favourite Led Zeppelin songs of all time on it, for a start, and I just don't think it gets enough... I don't think it gets enough praise. Like, it opens with The Song Remains the Same, which is a genius exercise in layering guitars and 12-string guitars, and he's just a really driving, catchy kind of epic, really. It's only 5.5 minutes, but it feels like it's longer, and it's just an assault. It's a great way to open an album. And then it goes into the Rain song, which is... Well, I'm going to talk about the Rain song in a minute. We'll come back to that.
So, I will say, because obviously I put House of the Holy as my overrated album, the Rain song is largely the part of that album that I consider a large exception, because it is a terrific song. Again, I don't actually dislike House of the Holy. I think it's a really, really, really good album. Song Remains the Same is great. The Rain song is great. And, I mean, I'm not a big reggae person, but if you're going to do reggae, you're going to do Jamaica, so...
Yeah,
it's some combination of that and Spirit of the Radio, so...
I'm not a big fan of Jamaica, to be honest. It's probably my least favourite track on that album. It's okay. I'm glad they didn't do more of it. It's okay.
Oh God, so glad they didn't do more of it. But equally,
like you mentioned Spirit of Radio, like the reggae section in that fits into the song, whereas I feel like Jamaica's a bit of a departure from, considering what the song that follows after Jamaica, which I'm going to talk about now,
which is a very good song as well. No Quarter is a terrific song.
which is brilliant, and it's one of the moodiest, most atmospheric things that Zeppelin ever did. I think I put it up there with In the Light, which is on Physical Graffiti, which we'll talk about later, as like generating a dark atmosphere. And it's actually notably a song that Tool have done a really good cover of, which I'm sure you've heard.
Of course I have. Also, Tool, by the way, people who have got very, very good taste in music, because they also open some of their shows with A Passage to Bangkok by Rush. So,
I mean, it's inevitable that we were going to like them, really, isn't it?
Yeah. It's almost like people who like good bands like other good bands.
It's amazing, isn't it? But, yeah, there's just a lot to like on this. The Ocean, which is the last song on the album, which is a great John Bonham sort of halftime shuffle thing that he's doing, which is a really, really good drum part, I think, on that. Over the Hills and Far Away, which is the third track, I like that as well. The Crunge, I like that as well. There's just a lot on there that I really, really like, and I don't think it gets as much. It doesn't get as much praise as 1, 2, and 3, 4, or Physical Graffiti does. And I'm going to segue neatly into my my underrated song choice as well. I've got one main one, and I've got two I'd like to honourably mention. My underrated song choice is the second track off House of the Holy. It is the Rain song. And I actually think that, in my humble opinion, this is a better ballad than Stairway to Heaven. This is a better acoustic moment than Stairway to Heaven by quite some margin. I wouldn't say it's that famous really in their discography, really. I would say up against some of the other songs it's up against.
No, it's not that
It's actually, to open the music nerd out for a second, it's actually in a really weird tuning. It's in open G sus4 tuning, which is D, G, C, G, C, D. So it's not a million miles away from open G tuning, which is the tuning that was probably made most commonly famous by Keith Richards. A lot of his Rolling Stone stuff was written in that tuning. But it's commonly referred to now as open page tuning because he kind of pioneered it. It's basically, if you play all the open strings, it's a G sus4 chord, and it's got a really just it's an example of some genius songwriting on an acoustic guitar, because it's such a great song that everything about it I just think is fantastic. I put it legions ahead of Stairway to Heaven on that front, on that sort of mellow acoustic ballad type thing, and it's got a load of mellotron on it as well, which is always a big thing for me because I fucking love the mellotron. It sounds great. But it's great. And I've got a couple of other little honourable mentions just before you do yours as well. One song that I think doesn't get as much praise as it should is the song Achilles' Last Stand, which is on the Presence album. From 1976. I personally think that is the song that invented Iron Maiden.
We're going to have a very good conversation in a second.
Well, because if you listen to that song, the galloping bass line in it that John Paul Jones is playing, and the layered guitars, I think that at one point there's something like 8 guitar layers on it, and it's a full-on driving. It's just a brilliant song. I love it, and I just think it's. Apparently, I read in a book once or somewhere that basically they did the bed track for it, so that like the bass and drums and like maybe a guide guitar, and then basically Page was holed up in a studio for like 24 hours straight, doing quite a lot of Colombian marching powder, and basically did all of the overdubs in one sitting.
Sorry, that's the most terrific expression I've heard in a long time.
It was, and apparently that's how that was basically recorded. He just basically holed himself up in a room and just did it in 24 hours straight. Which I think, as an orchestra of guitars goes, it's pretty impressive. And very, very quickly, finally, before I let you have the mic for a minute, I would like to give a big honourable mention to the song "The Battle of Evermore" from Led Zeppelin 4. Which is one of the rare occasions, I think it only happened once, where there's a guest vocalist on the song, and that is Sandy Denny, who was a vocalist in Fairport Convention, which were another big 70s band, and she has a great vocal interplay with Robert Plant, and it's just I mean, she had a great voice. She died sadly quite young, but she was great, and it suits that sort of acoustic thing really well. And I do actually think that a lot of the Led Zeppelin acoustic stuff is it's almost a lot better than the stuff that's a bit more sort of balls to the wall rock type stuff. Like, I'd rather listen to the Battle of Evermore a lot than maybe Immigrant Song.
I'm glad you pointed all of this out. So the first thing I'm going to point out is that something that you sort of briefly addressed there that I think should be mentioned in an overrated, underrated podcast about Led Zeppelin, which is that the fact that John Paul Jones as a musician is probably the most underrated musician of all time. The guy's unbelievable,
multi-instrumentalist.
But I feel like he has Alex Lifeson syndrome, where he's surrounded by highly acclaimed musicians in all of their instruments, if you will. I mean, vocalist as Robert Plant, as it were, but actually he does what Lars Ulrich is accused of doing, but actually doesn't do, which is that Lars Ulrich is a quite terrible drummer who's always accused of contributing more to the band than that one, if you like. But John Paul Jones is a legitimately good bassist and multi-instrumentalist who contributes significantly more to the composition of Led Zeppelin's music than anybody likes to agree with. And take 3 listens to Led Zeppelin entire discography and you'll understand exactly what I mean. Listen to Stairway to Heaven and tell me where all the instruments that aren't vocals, drums and guitar come from, because I can tell you where they come from. It's one man.
We had this conversation recently, actually. In fact, I've had it with several people. You think of these famous guitar-based songs, and all the most famous ones like Smoke on the Water and Whole Lot of Love is another one, and all that kind of thing. You can hum them. Try and hum or whistle the first notes of Stairway to Heaven. You can't, because it's picked out of a chord. It's really quite difficult to actually whistle the melody. The bit that you can whistle, if anything, from the intro is basically the mellotron. Well, it's not actually a mellotron, but I think he used one live. But it's basically a flute part, which is the bit that the bit that you hear in the background as the guitar's playing. That's John Paul Jones doing layers of flutes.
He is an extraordinarily underrated musician. As a multi-instrumentalist specifically. As a bass player, he was terrific, but as a bit of a Mike Oldfield, a bit of an organiser of music, he was absolutely amazing. And I think it's churlish to deny it, James.
I'm very proud to say that I have seen Robert Plant live, and he was great. Wolverhampton Civic Hall, he was brilliant. Did a few Led Zeppelin songs as well, which was always great. But I also have seen John Paul Jones live as well, and it's just over 10 years ago now. He was in I suppose you'd have to call it a supergroup called Them Crooked Vultures, which was him, Josh Homme from Queens of the Stone Age, and Dave Grohl. And they were brilliant. They were really, really good. I'm pleased to say that I've seen him.
And yeah, I would be too. The guy is a very, very, very underrated musician. And I think the fact that he was discreet, perhaps is the word to use, discreet in his musician life is probably what contributes to that, I think.
Yeah.
The John Bonhams and Jimmy Pages of the world perhaps weren't. But anyway, I felt that needed at least some lip service as well. But my underrated song, so I completely agree with you. I actually wrote 2 down for this. The first of which was Achilles' Last Stand. I completely agree. It is, in fact, the only saving grace on that album, in my opinion. We'll get to that a little bit later, but
nobody's fault but mine, though.
I think that song largely rescues that album, but in a particularly spectacular way. I think that is a very, very, very terrific song. But I won't pay too much more time to that, because the one song I want to talk about specifically, and because we've spoken at some length so far about Jimmy Page's acoustic endeavours, is I actually think Bronyor is their most underrated song, and I actually think it's one of their best songs, and it is such a good song.
Are you referring to the song Bron Ra from Physical Graffiti or Bron Ra Stomp?
No, Bron Ra. And in fact,
Three?
not only would I describe it as Bron Ra is one of their most underrated songs, I think Bron Ra Stomp is one of their most overrated songs in a weird way. But I am talking specifically about Bron Ra from Physical Graffiti. So
it is a beautiful acoustic guitar part. I'll be honest, it is brilliant. I can't say much more about it other than the fact that it is gorgeous.
It is one of the rare pieces of music that I wouldn't say it brings me to tears, but every time I hear it, I think that is a solemn and beautiful piece of music, and it's horrendously underappreciated by Led Zeppelin casual fans, which partly maybe because of the album it's on, which we'll come on to later, but I would consider that possibly their most underrated song if we're looking away from traditional songs. Achilles' Last Stand is an extraordinarily underrated song, but that's again it's the same thing. It's where it appears in their discography, where it appears on, what album it appears on, and where it appears.
It's a lovely little interlude on Physical Graffiti, that is, and you can just see, because I don't know if you know what Bron Ra is.
I have no idea. It sounds Welsh, but
well, it is. It's actually a cottage in Wales, which is where they recorded or wrote. I think they wrote most of Led Zeppelin 3 there, and I think part of Led Zeppelin 4, and it's this little remote cottage. You can visit it now. It's still there, and that's where those 2 songs get their name from. And you can just imagine in the middle of the Welsh mountains somewhere, a little cottage with a roaring log fire and 2 armchairs, and you've got Jimmy Page sitting in one, Robert Plant sitting in the other, and Jimmy Page has got a guitar, and he's like, "Oh yeah, do you like this?" And then he just knocks out Bron Ra.
It's the most Jimmy Page
another
thing
strange
ever, isn't
tuning,
it?
actually.
What tuning is that in?
It is in another strange one, which is not really often used. It's open C6 tuning.
Open
CAC GCE. Yeah. Another one for the music nerds there, yeah. Open C6 tuning. I don't know. There was a time where I could play Bron Ra. In fact, when we finish this, I'm going to relearn it. I learnt it years and years ago because I love it as well.
It's tremendous. I think it's the best piece of acoustic music that Led Zeppelin have done, or Jimmy Page has done, in my opinion.
Hard to argue.
Don't know why I like it so much. I think, and honestly, I think part of it is exactly as you just pointed out. It's the location on the album, but there's something haunting and
atmospheric.
Yeah, atmospheric and cathartic about it. That it's very. I don't know. I just really like it. I've always loved it, and I think as a band who are well known for being a heavy metal band, and B, a heavy metal band with a particularly big vocalist, like an acoustic solo song like that has a kind of strange presence, but it I don't know, it cuts an emotion in me that a lot of their songs don't, and it's hard for me not to love it for that.
Yeah, no, I can't argue. I think I love it as well, and it's oft overlooked, which is a key thing. We're obviously talking about underrated. Then yeah,
And
can't argue with that at all.
We are probably going to shift now to favourites and least favourites. Should we start with albums?
Would you like me to start with favourite, or would you like to start with favourite?
I'm going to start with favourite purely because we're on topic. But my favourite Led Zeppelin album is and always has been Physical Graffiti. It is their best album, and it is almost a no contest for me. I don't care what people say about Led Zeppelin 4. Physical Graffiti is better.
I cannot agree more.
It's simply the best album, and people
and
the
I
reason
knew we'd agree on this one.
The reason people don't want to admit it is because Led Zeppelin 4 has Stairway to Heaven, and people consider that not only the apex of their career but the apex of rock music. But it simply wasn't. Which is wrong. And the irony of it is that I don't actually think Custard Pie, the opening track, is a great track. But
do you not?
It's all right. It's not their best. Hilariously, I think the song "Houses of the Holy" is way better than the album. But...
I just thought, is there? Can you think of another? I was thinking of this when I was writing my notes for this. Can you think of another example where a band have recorded a song that is the same title as an album, but it's not featured on that album?
Absolutely not. I've had this conversation with myself in the past. I can think of self-titled songs, but it's always on the album at least.
I'm sure once upon a time, I'm sure I had another example of that happening where a song, I don't know, I'm going to have to, in fact, that's a good one for the listeners. If you know that, please comment, please tweet us at Over or Under Pod and let us know if you know any songs that are named after an album, but they don't actually appear on that album, because I know there's another example, and I did know it at one point, and I was very pleased with myself for knowing it, but I can't think of it off the top of my head now. So if you do know that, please do let us know. I'm going to be racking my brain on that one for the next couple of days, no doubt. It's interesting that you don't like Custard Pie, though. Because
I don't dislike it. It's not the best opening track in my opinion. The rest of the album has quite a significant ascendance, which I'm sure you and I will not disagree at all with. That comes into a particularly good crescendo of Houses of the Holy, Trampled Underfoot, and Kashmir.
But the reason I mentioned Custard Pie again, though, is because when I was writing my notes for the episode, I couldn't help but remember. Do you remember that time about almost 10 years ago now where I discovered that you actually once thought that Greggs was a local Kent-based bakery chain?
Literally hate you for this conversation. I don't know where it's going, but yes, that once happened.
Well, I've never really, asked this. It's almost like a forfeit, I suppose. But as sort of penance for that dose of idiocy, the next time I'm with you, I want to go into a Greggs with you. And when the store assistant comes up to you and asks you what you want, you're going to sing "Chew on a Piece of Your Custard Pie" in your best Robert Plant impression.
What am I doing that forfeit for?
My amusement.
Oh, so there's no... This is not a punishment for anything other than your smugness?
Other than being an idiot and not knowing that Greggs was, a UK-wide chain. Just as you're like forfeit for that, you've got to go into a Greggs and sing "Chew on a Piece of Your Custard Pie" in your best Robert Plant impression.
I'm going to shut...
the store assistant asks you what you want. Chew on a piece of your custard pie.
What is your... What just you explain... You... we were talking about favourite albums, weren't we? My favourite album is Physical Graffiti, and I think it's a bit of a no contest, but...
I completely agree. Physical Graffiti is also my favourite album. It benefits by being a double album for a start, which is there's a huge breadth of material on this, and if there's one album that really does showcase everything that the band can do mood-wise and tone-wise and light and dark and everything in between, this is the one that does it. And there's so much brilliant stuff on there. In My Time of Dying is some great slide guitar work from Jimmy Page on that, and just a really mean, heavy kind of driving song again. Like you said, House of the Holy is great. Trampled Underfoot's catchy, bit of a send up to the disco music that was going on around the sort of mid-70s. In the Light is another one that's really kind of dark and creepy, and a bit like No Quarter, it kind of drones around a bit, and it's quite plodding and ominous. And there's another song, I mean, I've got to mention the fact that there's a song called Black Country Woman on there, which is obviously a reference to Robert Plant and John Bonham's upbringing, particularly Robert Plant, who's, you know, famously from the Midlands. In fact, on that note, I'd just like to say very quickly that about 1.5 miles away from where I went to school, secondary school, there is a pub called the Three Men in a Boat. Well, there was. It's not there anymore. But it was in that pub that Led Zeppelin manager Peter Grant sent a telegram requesting that John Bonham come for an audition to be in Led Zeppelin. And it was a pub that was also frequented by Robert Plant, because they were friends already, and also Noddy Holder.
Yes.
And that is a claim to fame for my region, if I've ever heard one. Not only have we got one of the best Christmas songs, in my opinion, of all time from our neck of the woods, but also that's where Robert Plant and John Bonham were asked to join Led Zeppelin.
The West Midlands have done an awful lot for heavy metal music.
We haven't even mentioned Black Sabbath.
I was going to say, we've not mentioned Black Sabbath, and amongst other things.
But yeah, I just thought I'd throw that one in there. But yeah, anyway, Physical Graffiti, there's so much great stuff on that album, particularly in the sort of first two sides of it, first 2 or 3 sides. And it will be remiss of me, for obvious reasons, because I'm going to make reference to it right now, about favourite songs, but the song Kashmir features on that album. And what could you possibly say about... I mean, Kashmir, in my opinion, it's one of the best things they ever did. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah, there's absolutely no denying that. I've heard it referred to as the best display of every individual band member's musical prowess and ability, and I think that's a fair description.
Yeah, it's not the flashiest guitar-based song, but it is probably the definitive example of Jimmy Page employing a different guitar tuning again, although not acoustically this time, and that is the infamous Dadgad tuning, D-A-D-G-A-D, which is probably the tuning that's most associated with him, because it's not the only time he used it. He used it on a song on Led Zeppelin 1, actually, White Summer / Black Mountainside, which is a bit of an instrumental-y kind of thing. That's the other notable example that he used that tuning, but it is the definitive version of that tuning that I think anybody's ever used, really, and it kind of made the tuning famous, I suppose. But it's that Middle Eastern kind of, it's like a mantra. It's hard to explain what it is. Obviously, everyone has at least heard this song at some point in their life, but it is one of my favourites, and I'm going to list it as my ultimate favourite song. I've got a little, again, a bit like my Underrated, I've got a little bit of a caveat as well that I would like to mention. The song When the Levee Breaks. From Led Zeppelin 4. It is the most sampled drum sound of all time. Don't know if you know that. Rappers,
I did.
Everyone in between have used that John Bonham intro, and for good reason, because it sounds tremendous. It sounds like the gods punching the earth. It's just so heavy, and it's just great, and it's such a great song in general. And it's probably my favourite song off Led Zeppelin 4, actually.
And that's a valid... curious that neither of us have mentioned Led Zeppelin 4 as an overrated or favourite album. Probably should make some lip service to it.
My second favourite album.
And I would agree that it's my second favourite album. And I feel like, based on the fact that nothing on that is going to come under least favourite, is it? Realistically, I mean,
No.
I presume you're not going to put "Stairway to Heaven" as your favourite song.
No, that's Kashmir.
Yeah, exactly. So, like at this point, it seems inevitable that we probably should at least make some lip service to the fact that Led Zeppelin 4, very, very famous album, and the song that's obviously most famous for is "Stairway to Heaven." Now, I'm not sure if you or I would ever describe it as not our most overrated song. We might describe it as a little bit overrated on the whole. What opinions do you have on "Stairway to Heaven," James?
I think it's a great song, and it's unusual in a lot of senses that it builds up to a sort of a crescendo. It speeds up, it builds up. It starts with just the acoustic guitar and it ends with the full band and one of the most famous guitar solos of all time, which is played on a Telecaster, contrary to popular belief. It's not actually played on his double neck guitar, which is the guitar that he made famous because of that song live. It was not played on that. It's played on a Tele. The biggest thing with Stairway to Heaven in recent years has been the fact that it's come under quite a lot of scrutiny from plagiarism claims. Now, the most notable of which is by the band Spirit, which were a contemporary of Led Zeppelin, who I believe they did actually tour with at one point. I think they were their opening act.
That's where the principal plagiarism claims have come from, because they toured and played with them.
Yeah, see, the problem I have with that, like I've heard the Spirit song many times, and I've heard it compared next to Stairway to Heaven. I understand why people see the similarities in it. I really do, but if you understand a little bit about songwriting and music theory in particular, you'll realise that the phenomenon that is at play in the Stairway to Heaven intro is far more common than you'd think. And there's something in songwriting that's known as a line cliche. Now, a line cliche is either an ascending or descending chromatic sequence. The line cliche in Stairway to Heaven is, you can hear it in the bass note of the acoustic bit. You can hear it climbing down, which is the main sort of hook of the riff, I suppose you could call it. He starts with A, then it drops to G sharp, then G, then F sharp, then F. So it's climbing down, it's that descending pattern. And that the line cliche in that style is utilised by lots of different bands in lots of different famous songs. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that right now. Calling back to our Beatles podcast, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, that's a line cliche. The song Something by George Harrison is also a line cliche. It's just a climbing down a chromatic pattern. That's all that is. And that is what is it's more accentuated in Stairway to Heaven because it's part of the, it's such a big part of the intro to it. But it's the same thing that's going on in Something. And interestingly, George Harrison was actually a Led Zeppelin fan, and he knew the band personally and went to various events and parties, etc. with them. And he actually infamously once told Jimmy Page that he thought the band was great, but they need to write more ballads. And then immediately after George Harrison said that to him, Jimmy Page wrote the Rain song. And if you listen to the Rain song and then listen to Something, you'll realise that the first two chords of the Rain song are basically a complete homage to Something.
Something in the way she moves.
That's the song that's most influenced by somebody else, in my opinion. It's nothing to do with Spirit and, a song that most people probably wouldn't have even heard now. If it hadn't been for this lawsuit, it's just purely a function of music. It's the same as the same four chords can be found in sequence in a lot of songs from all over different artists, and it's just a function of songwriting.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there is always a temptation, and I'm sure any of our listeners who have listened to our podcast for some time and are familiar with yours and your opinion and my opinion, maybe would have expected certainly me and possibly yourself to have put Stairway to Heaven as our most overrated Led Zeppelin song. And the reason I haven't is, I think, yes, there's an objective reason to say that it's always considered not only their best song, but possibly the greatest rock song of all time. And I don't think that's necessarily accurate. But I think the song in its own merits does enough things brilliantly that it's almost a slap in the face to call it overrated in some ways.
Yeah, that's where I sort of sat on that. And obviously, with the plagiarism thing over it as well, it's become a bit of a myth, you know, about whether they wrote this song. And actually, I'm just, to conclude this discussion, I'm going to insert right now an audio clip of a song by Noel Gallagher's High Flying Birds, which we've seen live. It's a song called The Girl with X-Ray Eyes, and if you want any form of plagiarism attack at Led Zeppelin for nicking Stairway to Heaven, then you've got to attack Noel Gallagher for nicking Stairway to Heaven, because the intro to this sounds a lot like that.
Something that I think is worth mentioning about Led Zeppelin and their kind of function as a band as well is that some combination of, I guess, kudos and possibly laziness or foresight from Jimmy Page is that a lot of their music, particularly with regard to the fact that they have very, very obvious guitar solos in their songs, was almost semi-designed to be recorded on, you know, on album, as it were. But actually live, Jimmy Page was very, very, very well known for improvising.
Oh, yeah, and actually it's interesting you should mention that, because I'm just going to, before you finish that, I'm just going to, my honourable mention in my favourite category, which I'm not really counting as a suggestion because it's not a studio album, but there's a live album it was only released in 2003, called How the West Was Won, which is by far and away the best live example of Led Zeppelin you'll ever hear in your life. It was recorded in 1972, which was right at their zenith. You know, they were on top of the world at that point. And I highly recommend giving it a listen, because a lot of the songs get extended. Days Are Confused lasts for like 20 minutes, and they just go into like all of the different things. It's a big medley, and it sounds tremendous. And I'll play a clip of it right now. About improvisation is all of the songs ended up being like Stairway to Heaven's got like a 5-minute guitar solo in it, which is great. It's all improvised, it sounds brilliant. That was the biggest draw of them at the time,
and I think that's something that needs to be valued about Stairway to Heaven as a song, particularly because it's a song where it's got an extraordinarily famous guitar solo, which is and instantly we were talking about things about, you know, why might it can be considered underrated. I don't think the guitar solo is underrated. I don't think it's overrated. I don't think it's the best guitar solo of all time, but I think that is a conversation that's infinitely debatable. But it's certainly
it's very clever, because it's in the conversation.
Right, it's terrific. And this, we'll get onto that in a second about hitting the right notes, but it is a terrific guitar solo, and the song does a number of things particularly well on all instruments. It builds up extremely well. It builds to a very, very obvious crescendo. It gives everybody the illusion of where the drums are going to come in, and every cunt gets it wrong, which is absolutely terrific.
Yep.
But the things it does right, I think it does right well enough that, yes, it's probably a bit overrated as a song, but it does the good things well enough that I think it's too much of an insult to call it their most overrated song. I'm not sure how much you agree with that, but
it's been elevated by people. I don't think it was ever they wrote it as a song. You know, it was a song. It's people that have done the filling in the gaps on that, and because there's such a mystique around the band as well, that kind of, and there was just making a little bit of a reference, because I know we push for time here, but there was a famous incident. A popular thing in the 1970s was something called backmasking, which is this ridiculous phenomenon of people playing records backwards and finding hidden messages in them. And Stairway to Heaven was one of the songs that went under the microscope of satanic messages in music. And these people who would play there, I don't even know how you play a vinyl record backwards, to be honest, because I didn't think turntables went that way, but never mind. There was this phenomenon about people listening to music backwards and finding these hidden messages in there. The Beatles had all this as well, famously about Paul McCartney being dead, and it's, you know, the secrets are hidden if you listen to the records backwards. I don't know who does that or why.
No, I've also met Paul McCartney. I can tell you he's definitely not dead.
Yeah, and it becomes part of the mystique. And there was this incident with, if you play Stairway to Heaven backwards, there's a part of it that sounds a little bit like Robert Plant singing about Satan. it was all to do with it because Jimmy Page was really into his sort of occult mythology and stuff like that. People like Aleister Crowley, who became famous with Ozzy Osbourne writing a song called Mr. Crowley. All that sort of occult symbology, which is on the fourth album anyway, in the symbols, it added to this dark mystique about the band, and obviously everyone was looking for satanic connections, and it was all a bit weird, and that also elevated the song, I think, above a lot of their other material, because there was this like, it's, there's some message in there, and it's all nonsense, but who listens to records backwards at the end of the day?
Anyway, we've digressed somewhat substantially from you and I calling our favourite album Physical Graffiti, which I think, is generally considered one of their best 2 or 3 albums, and I think I think it's a no contest for me personally. I think it's just simply the best album it has. It does everything it should do and more, and it would be remiss of me to not pay a little bit of just, I don't want to say lip service, because I feel like it deserves more than lip service, but to mention the sequence of songs specifically of Houses of the Holy, Trampled Underfoot, and Kashmir, because Trampled Underfoot, I think, is actually one of their really underrated songs because it's got a very, very good guitar riff in it, but Kashmir specifically is one of the more impressive things that Led Zeppelin composed. And I know you've kind of made some mention to it as well, but this is probably a good opportunity to talk a little bit more.
It's also a great time to mention once again Mr. Underrated, John Paul Jones, who is responsible for the orchestration on Kashmir, which really adds to it, the full sort of orchestral thing that's going on in there. That's all him.
Yep, absolutely. The guy did everything. Look, what can you say?
And if you've never seen it, by the way, I know you and I have because we went to see it in the cinema together, but if the listeners have never seen it, I highly recommend that you check out their 2007 reunion show, which was released in about 2013 as a full DVD. It's the one and only time they ever reunited properly with Jason Bonham on drums, who was John Bonham's son.
Who
did a tremendous job.
Really, really impressive job.
If ever you could say your dad would be proud, it's watching that. It's just like, it's tremendous. But the version of Kashmir they do on that, which I think is the last song before the encores, is the definitive version of that. It sounds biblical.
I've not spoken at all about my favourite song. Now, my favourite song, I've split it into 2. My favourite song is either Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You or When the Levee Breaks. Now, I'm going to talk about When the Levee Breaks first of all, because as James rightly noted earlier, it has probably the most famous drum riff, and certainly the most famous or most sampled drum riff of all time. As a drummer who's a big fan of, say, Neil Peart, for example, John Bonham's probably my second favourite drummer. The guy was an absolute powerhouse, and he did a lot of things that people don't realise he did, and he was very good at things that a lot of people don't think he was good at. But When the Levee Breaks is a very, very, very transient example of when he does nothing complicated, but he does everything he needs to. Hits his bass. Very, very famous. Famously, John Bonham was very famous for having an absolute rabbit foot on the bass pedal, which has been almost unreplicated since. But he does it extraordinary.
Good Times, Bad Times.
Yeah, Good Times, Bad Times, one of the first songs they released, are really probably the best example of that. He was very, very efficient, should we say. But his use of dynamics, I think specifically, is very, very unparalleled. Like, a lot of drummers are very good with technicality, and they're very good at utilising tone and different drums. John Bonham was very, very good at using an average size kit, but using literally noise to his advantage. The dynamic in his playing worked very, 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 very well, and this is something that people often aim at Keith Moon a little bit as well. Keith Moon I'm not quite as much of a fan of for different reasons, but But When the Levee Breaks is a really, really good example of where he uses dynamics to his advantage, and the bass pedal work in When the Levee Breaks is a very, very poignant example. If you were to look from a more of a sort of timbre perspective, the dynamic between the bass and the snare drum in that song is particularly notable. And bear in mind, John Bonham was very, very well known as a loud drummer as well. He really, really utilises the quiet space in that particular intro very, very well.
A lot of that sound also does come from the fact that it was recorded in a staircase of an old country manor, where they recorded all of Led Zeppelin 4, called Headley Grange, which was a old stately home kind of thing, and they had that rented out, and I think they recorded a couple of their albums there actually, but the drums were basically placed at the bottom of this massive cavernous staircase, and then it was mic'd up in a certain way, so there was some mics on the drum kit, and then there were also mics up on the up the top of the staircase kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's where you get that real cavernous kind of noise from. Obviously, a lot of it comes from the power in his drumming anyway, but the fact that a lot of it also comes from the fact that it's the surrounding, and it's a classic example of Page being a great producer as well, because it's most of the drum sounds of those times, even back in the Beatles days, they sounded quite. They were in tiny little rooms in cubicles, they were blocked away, and they were quite not muffled, but they didn't breathe. They didn't have, there was no breath in the drumming. It was just a sound. It was just a smack sound. Whereas this is like, it was just a noise, yeah. And this is when it became like. The reason that drum sounds so good is because it's got this whole cavernous space, and you've got all these multiple microphones all picking up this natural echo in a big space, and that's why it's so good. In the interest of time, we probably should skip on to our least favourite. You mentioned something earlier on about the Levee Breaks with Robert Plant's vocals, which in the early days certainly were a big sort of unique selling point, I suppose, of the band itself. In 1977, as I alluded to in the intro, Robert Plant was involved in a car crash, which actually left him in a wheelchair for a short period of time while he was recovering. So much so that actually he recorded all of his vocals for Achilles' Last Stand in a wheelchair, basically because he was still convalescing from all of that. Towards this sort of period, his voice started to not have the same impact that it formerly had, in my view, and it's certainly notable by the time you get to the Presence album, and particularly things like Achilles' Last Stand. His voice becomes a lot thinner and more, he's straining for notes a bit more, and he can't really do the sort of the primal scream that he had in the sort of first 4, 5, 6 albums, and it's no more evidenced that the fact that the band were becoming a bit weaker by this point than my least favourite album, which is the In Through the Outdoor album, which
is the correct answer.
It's the only album that they ever released that I don't like. I don't really like anything on it, with the possible exception of In the Evening, which is the first song. It's while when this album was recorded, they'd just finished what would end to be their what would end up being their last ever American tour in 1977, and they recorded this in 1978. And the last American tour was marred by a lot of different incidents as well, which if you people who are interested can look into what happened on that tour and various dark occurrences, and it wasn't that great, and they weren't playing that well either, even though they were selling more tickets than ever, and they were playing ever greater sized arenas. It just something wasn't right with it, and a lot of it was to do with the fact that Jimmy Page in particular had a massive heroin addiction at this point, and he'd been nursing it for a few years, but by 1977, if you look at a picture of him in 1977, he looks like he's death on legs, like he's turned into a stick insect, and he looks really, really ill, which he was because he was on heroin. And by the time they got around to recording this album, he was basically out of it most of the time, which is an issue when you're the leader of a band. And In Through the Outdoor plays like it was basically the only person who was functioning at this point really was John Paul Jones, and it kind of comes across as a bit of like he had to kind of take the reins a bit more than he normally would have done. And part of the fact that it's infused with some 1980s sounds that I wasn't that enamoured with at any point really just makes this a complete misstep, in my opinion. It's just not very good. there's nothing on that album that I would ever want to hear again, really.
It's the only album by a genuinely terrific band that I would describe as legitimately just poor on every facet. There's almost nothing good on it.
Yeah, it's just bad.
It is just as exactly as you said, and they're a band that are winding down at this point. And is it unfair to say that after Physical Graffiti, they released, I mean, I would say 2.5 albums. I'm not even sure what to make of Coda, to be honest with you, but I'm not a big fan of Presence, but In Through the Outdoor was even worse, and it's really...
It's just not very good. Like, nothing on that. It sounds cheesy.
I think they're a band of 9 albums where they release 6 good albums and 3 awful albums in a strange way. There's no middle ground in a strange, funny...
I don't think Presence is awful. I know you're not a huge fan of it, but it's got Achilles' Last Stand on it, and T for One.
Achilles' Last Stand is... but again, it's the opening song, and there's nothing good after it, in my opinion.
Like I said, I like T for One, which is the last song, which is quite good, but the real one that's deserving of vitriol, I think, the only one of their albums is In Through the Outdoor, because I just don't think it's very good.
It's not easy.
While I obviously wish that what happened to John Bonham, i.e. him drinking about 15 double vodkas and then choking on his own vomit, I wish that had not happened, obviously, because it was a great tragedy, and he died only 2 years after Keith Moon in sort of semi-similar circumstances, which is... It's a shame to lose 2 of the giants of the drumming world in that era within a couple of years, but I'm quite glad in a way that they didn't carry on into the 80s, because if In Through the Outdoor was indicative of what was to come, I'm kind of glad that they stopped when they did, because it's just not very good. I mean, I'm going to have to mention what my least favourite Led Zeppelin song of all time is, I suppose, and it's a bit of a tough mix, a tough pick, because I'd probably just say all of In Through the Outdoor. But my least favourite one is the first track of side 2, which is called I can't even say it properly. Carasalambra, which is 10.5 minutes of absolute I just don't like it. It starts badly and gets worse from there. I don't. It's just terrible.
It's really interesting you say that, because we had a conversation before this podcast where we thought essentially that we were going to disagree on everything, but we've agreed on way more than I thought, and that is also my least favourite song.
I'm glad you've said Carasalambra is your least favourite song as well, because it's zero reason why it needs to be 10.5 minutes long, and it's just a long, dirgy patch on a poor album, I think.
Yeah, it's just appalling. It's just there's no saving any part of it.
And I'm not really counting Coda because it was released after John Bonham's death.
Funny you should say that, because I was going to make a bit of a point of saying that I kind of end the discography before that because of the fact that it doesn't have the entire band.
I mean, he's on it.
Yeah, but
John Bonham's
been
drumming
released.
on it.
In 1982 it's not really. It's released
posthumous release.
Yeah, and
it doesn't. I don't really count it in their discography properly, because, like I said, it was just made up of basically outtakes. And
it is also awful,
bits.
but for those who aren't aware, it is also quite terrible. But
yeah, it's not great. There's maybe 1 or 2 decent bits on it, but on the whole, it's not really them. It's just Jimmy Page releasing what they had left in the vault, I suppose. But In Through the Outdoor, they're all very much alive and well. Well, some of them are well. I wouldn't say Page was well at this point, but yeah, he was. In fact, he didn't cool off the heroin until the early 80s, and I think he had a period of convalescence after that where he cooled off from that, and otherwise he wouldn't be here now probably. But it's amazing what that drug can do to people.
So on that note, I think it's fair to say we had some mixed opinions on Led Zeppelin, but for the most part, there was quite a solid amount of agreement, James. And have you got anything to add to the conversation we've been having so far?
Not especially, to be honest. I think we've covered most of it, to be honest. But yeah, they're always going to be a legendary band, and they've probably been elevated to more legendary status given the fact that they were only around for 12 years, and they sort of ended with the sad event, and i.e. John Bonham, and they deserve almost all of the praise they get. I think there's always going to be room for people to say, oh, it's a bit overrated, and, you know, X band was better. And yeah, they're not my favourite band of all time. There's been times in my life where they've been hugely important, and, you know, Jimmy Page has been an influence, certainly, at some stage or another. You know, I can't knock the bloke, but it's always difficult with bands like this. It was difficult with the Beatles. It can be difficult with Zeppelin and Floyd as well, to some degree. They're one of the biggest bands of that era, and I do think they deserve the accolade more so than some others that I think we've not done podcasts about yet. But yeah, I'll give them most of their credit for the variety of the output. It's not just rock and roll type stuff. There's so much light and shade in there, and, you know, the fact that you and I both pinpointed Bron Ra as being a particular highlight, which is like a 2-minute acoustic thing, just shows the variety in the band's output.
And if there's nothing else to say about that, James, I think that's probably about where to wrap up for today.
It is. You've been listening to the first of our podcasts in 2021. Let's all hope that we have a much better year than last year. Thank you very much for listening to us for the last year or so in our two different guises. We'll have plenty more podcast material for you in 2021 as we navigate through what will hopefully be a better year. Do give us a follow on Twitter and a comment at over or under pod. That's at over or under pod. And let us know if there's anyone you'd like us to do a podcast about. All that's left to be said then is he's been Alex.
And he's been Jet. Oh, fuck off.
Sorry, mate.
What was that?
That's my smoke alarm.
So to wrap things up for this edition, all that's left to be said is he's been Alex.
He's been James.
We'll speak to you again soon.